let's go ahead and get started. We're here this morning. My name is Paul Ortiz. We're with Dr. Carl Barfield, who is an emeritus professor at the University of Florida. And it is October 23rd, 2023. We're doing the interview under the auspices of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida. Carl, first of all, thank you for taking time out of your schedule this morning to speak with us.
My pleasure.
Well, I wonder, Dr. Barfield, if you want to start, kind of where you feel comfortable starting. I know you have a lot of stories to tell. You were a award-winning, incredibly popular and valued teacher for 3.5 decades at the University of Florida. Where do you want to start at?
Well, let's start at the beginning. I was born on December the 17th, 1947, in a very small country town in Northeast Texas. It was named New Boston, and it was about 10 miles south of Oklahoma and about 20 miles west of Arkansas, right in the corner by the Red River. It was an extremely small town. There was one school. The people I started first grade with, I graduated high school with, unless they died or moved away. And so it was a rather interesting experience. I graduated high school in the spring of 1966. Now, that decade was pretty traumatic. During my undergraduate years at college and finishing high school, I watched 3 political assassinations, 2 Kennedys and a King. I watched the civil rights movement and all the trauma that went with that, the counterculture hippie movement. As a matter of fact, I attended Woodstock, so that was a rather interesting phenomenon. And I lost 9 friends in Vietnam. I would have gone to Vietnam had my draft number come up, but in the fall of 1969, they held the first lottery, and I was number 303, so my number never came up, so I did not go. Now, it was interesting because people asked me when I first started, what do you want to do in life? I had no idea. When I started as a freshman, I said, what I want is an education. And Dr. Ortiz, it took me years to figure out what I had demanded of myself. When I say I wanted an education, I had no idea what I was really saying, but I learned it as time went on. I ended up getting a double major in mathematics and biology, which was a very strange combination at that time. Little did I know when I got to a PhD, I would be building systems models for biological systems. And so that worked out quite nicely. I finished my bachelor's degree in 1970 and entered a master's program at Stephen F. Austin State University in Nacogdoches, Texas, and ended up with a master's degree in biology. At the end of that, I got a call from Texas A&M University asking if I would like to pursue a PhD in entomology. Now, that's just another biological science, so I accepted it. And I spent 4 years in College Station, Texas, getting a PhD in entomology. I made up my mind then what I wanted to dedicate my life to was working with the poorest of the poor. I had a passion against the synthetic organic pesticide industry. They were poisoning people, and they were very unscrupulous. In the course of finishing my degree, I was offered a position at the University of Florida in 1976. I finished my dissertation, got married, moved to Florida in the span of 10 days. We got married on a Saturday night and moved to Florida Sunday morning. I paid for that trip for decades. Every time she wanted something, it was, you drugged me off to Florida from my East Texas home. I met her, and she worked down the hall in the lab where I worked. And she was married one time before me, and interestingly enough, I went to that wedding. So it was a rather interesting set of circumstances. I arrived in Gainesville, Florida in late summer of 1976 and began what was a 35-year career at the University of Florida.
Wow. What was Gainesville like, Carl, when you first moved here? Of course, now people talk about so many of the changes that have happened, but what was it like back in the 1970s?
It was a town. All of Plaza or Plaza North was a note that my internet connection is unstable. Hopefully it'll hang on.
Okay, yeah, you want
I
just go ahead and repeat what you just said, and it's back up.
only 4,000 students, and it was only. And so when I started there, students would register by hand. There was no computer registration. They would stand in long lines, and they would get up to the registration desk and find out that section was closed, and then they would have to go stand in another long line. Registration was an absolute nightmare. 20 years later, I was the head of a committee that did the what is it called? Every 10 years, you have to do an accreditation study. And so my committee recommended the implementation of computer registration, and they bought it. And so now students have the registration system, and everything's on the computer, and it works. It's nice. They have a period of time. That was not the way it was in 1976 at all. Students would line up in what is now the College of Health and Human Performance, which back then was the old Florida gym. They called it Alligator Alley because there was about 3 feet between the stands and the court, and it was a sweat box. And students would, in fact, would stand in those long lines in that gymnasium for their registration.
So the campus back then was a bit smaller. Could you talk about what it was like for you as an assistant professor, kind of coming into your field, and what your department was like? And
it took a long time for me to meet all my faculty colleagues, because at that time entomology was housed in 6 different buildings. It would be years, decades later before they would build us our own building. And so there were a lot of faculty that I served with for maybe 10 years and never even met, because they were somewhere else on campus. And that was a very common for the College of Agriculture. Back then, it was only IFAS, Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. Many years later, they had that as the research branch of agriculture, and CALS, the College of Agricultural and Life Sciences, as the academic and teaching part of the College of Agriculture. So there were two entities there. There were something like, at that time, I think there was about 15,000 faculty and 24,000 students. Now, of course, there's 53,000 students and about 30,000 faculty. So it has grown immensely in that period of time. I served through 5 UF presidents, and I had the one I admired the most. I don't know if I should say that here, but we'll keep that to me. I served as associate provost under the John Lombardi era and moved from entomology to the provost office, where Betty Capaldi at that time was provost. I was given 9 assignments while I was there. One of them was to be chief grievance officer at the university. And that's when I learned that faculty don't always do the things they should be doing. And so I had to settle a lot of that stuff. And I also dealt with professional school students and doctoral level students and their various complaints about faculty and coursework.
Yeah.
I also was part of building the first and only transfer manual for community college students that listed all the majors at the University of Florida, whether it was restricted admission or limited access admission or not, and all the prerequisites. That had never existed before. It was then developed and put in the hands of all what were then community colleges. Most of them now are just colleges. Back then, I was the liaison officer with all the community colleges and the provost office.
Very good. Carl, I wonder if you wouldn't mind backing up a moment with your academic practice. And you mentioned the thing that really drove you into your field of research, and you have this passion about, and can you talk more about that? Like what
Sure.
really, yeah.
Paul, there were two things that came out of World War II that contributed significantly and negatively to agriculture. One was DDT as the first synthetic organic pesticide. It was invented, discovered by a Swiss chemist, and it was used in the soldiers of World War II as a dust. And they would drop it down inside their uniforms to kill body lice because they would spend tremendous amounts of time without being able to change clothes or bathe. It did a very, very good job of body lice killing. When World War II was over, it was discovered it also killed mosquitoes. And so there were huge projects in this country to spray the indoor residences of people to prevent malaria. And because they discovered mosquitoes after a blood meal would fly into the inside of the house and hang upside down on the wall. So there was a dust developed to spray the inside of homes. And there were commercials that were put out by the Department of Agriculture that showed cows, for example, singing, DDT is good for me. That all stayed intact until Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring in 1962 and talked about the dying bird populations because of eggshell thinning. That changed everything. Now, the individual who gave Rachel Carson the data sets to form her hypothesis was one of my colleagues at the University of Florida. His name was Dr. Reese Seiler, S-A-I-L-E-R. He is deceased now, but he was the man behind the scene that gave her the information. Well, it turns out that DDT is not very toxic acutely. You don't fall over dead. It's the long-term cumulative effects that are the problem. So I began to investigate what was happening in the third world. And I found that all around the world, the major industrial countries, the United States, Britain, Germany, China, Japan, would all ban substances in their country and export them to the third world for use. Perfectly legal, but highly unethical. And people in the third world who were often illiterate in their own language, even though the label would say safe and effective if used according to label instructions, many of them could not read the label instructions. And they referred to these compounds as plant medicines. Now, I want you to picture yourself as being in the country of Honduras. You're in the second poorest country in the world. It's hot, it's dry, and it's miserable to stand out in your vegetable garden with a hoe and chop weeds all day long. So somebody wants to give you a compound that will kill those weeds by simply pouring it over them and tells you they'll give it to you if the government will subsidize it. I would do it too. It's not illogical, okay? It's not illogical at all. I have held in my own arms, Paul, in my career, 5 children who died as I held them from paraquat poisoning. That is immensely toxic to mammals. There is no antidote. And it's a terrible thing to watch because Dad had some paraquat and poured it around the outside of the fence or around his garden, and the children got access to it because children get into everything. Now, it had 2 characteristics that was very desirable. 1, it killed anything green. So if it was a weed, it would die. 2, it was cheap. And if you're the second poorest country in the world, you want cheap. The next compound up was gramoxone. It was a Roundup. It was 10 times more expensive. They couldn't afford it. Today, gramoxone has its own health issues, and it's often been linked to Alzheimer's and what's the other one? Parkinson's disease, okay? So as I begin to look around, this billion-dollar industry practiced unethically. Now, I ran a project in Dominican Republic for a while, and I was trying to get to use biological control to control pests in vegetables. And I found out that the local pesticide company, Bayer, the same people that make your aspirin, were coming in after I left and convincing my workers to go ahead and spray anyway. So how do I do this? Did I cheat? Yeah, but I left a message on my desk one evening as I left because I knew they were breaking in my office and reading my mail. It said, "Dear sirs at the Latin American Bureau of USAID, have just discovered that 4 of the 5 pesticides used here cause impotency. Please advise." There was a 99% drop in pesticide use Monday morning. Did I tell the truth? No. Did I think that the end justified the means? Yes. And we were able to demonstrate that biological control worked. So you find yourself in these situations, you do what you do to survive.
Yeah. Now, Carl, who was breaking into your office?
Oh yeah, the workers would at the request of the chemical company to find out what I was saying back to Washington.
Okay.
That's not unusual. That's not unusual. I worked in my career, Paul. I worked in 31 countries, and every one of them were the poorest of the poor. And let me show you how poor. One of my colleagues and I developed a handheld pocket disposable, that is the size of a pack of cigarettes, color guide to all the pests of corn in Honduras. There was a color picture of all the pests and what to do about it written in Spanish. And it would fit inside of a shirt pocket. We did and worked on that till we got the price down, even with color pictures, to less than $5 US each. They couldn't afford that. We had to go get a grant and pay for it ourselves and just give it to them. You're talking about sheer poverty. They have nothing. So I'm proud of the fact that, I was in the chief of party of a review project for the Indonesian National Rice Pest Management Program. And I was with a friend of mine, a colleague named Peter Kenmore. Peter and I were in graduate school together. I was at Texas A&M. He was at the University of California at Berkeley. We met at a meeting and became friends. He was running this project in Asia that I reviewed, so we spent time together. We had a knock on the door one night in the hotel. It was Interpol. And I had never messed with Interpol, and these are serious dudes. And they said, "Are you Peter Kenmore?" And I said, "No." Now, Peter, several months earlier, had convinced the political dictator of Indonesia, Suharto, to adopt pest management as the national policy. And he did away with $300 million in pesticide purchases every year. The pesticide company didn't like that. They put out a contract on Peter Kenmore's life. Interpol found it out and informed him. He spent several nights not sleeping in the same hotel room the same night twice. That's how serious it is.
Wow. So these companies saw you and Professor Kenmore as cutting into their profit margin.
Oh yeah. It's all about volume of sale. That's the name of the game, volume of sale. They don't care whether it's deadly or not, because there are no law. When the entomology building at the University of Florida, the new one, was built, the time between which the contractor bought thousands of gallons of a termiticide, which by law you have to put underneath a building structure to prevent termites, by the time they were going to use it, it was banned by the Environmental Protection Agency. No problem. The contractor got on the phone, made a phone call, shipped it to Kenya. It was perfectly usable there. Nothing illegal about that at all. By the way, the same thing happens with pharmaceuticals. As a matter of fact, in many cases, the pesticide industry and the pharmaceutical industry are different divisions of the same company. So I got passionate about this. It was my passion in life.
Now, Carl, did you ever get, these are research topics that have an impact on, as you mentioned, on really poor people, on poor countries. they also have an impact on the bottom line of some corporations. Were there other people within your profession at that time who were also identified with trying to, kind of set things right, make things less toxic for poor people? Was this kind of, you mentioned Rachel Carson, for example, but also kind of the person behind her. Were there other people notable in this kind of effort to create a more equitable kind of ecosystem?
Yes, there were. There were a number of people who put their entire emphasis on the use of predators, parasites, and pathogens to control pests rather than synthetic chemicals. And there were a number of them. Many of them are deceased now. Remember, I've been retired 12 years, and so I think only 3 of the colleagues that I started with in 1976 are still living. That's just the way life works. Okay, so there were a lot of very successful projects. Most of them in this country, some in a foreign country, but I did more foreign work, I think, than most everybody else because that's what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I got funding through Agency for International Development mostly. I was an adjunct faculty member at the Pan American School of Agriculture in Zamorano, Honduras for 10 years. And I taught all over West Indies and Jamaica in Kingston.
Excellent. How was your research, Carl, received at the University of Florida? I'm just thinking about the trajectory of an assistant professor and the demands in terms of getting tenure and teaching and those types of things. So how did you kind of integrate your research work with your early life as an academic?
Well, of course, the name of the game in academia is you got to do research, you got to publish. The university will give you an office and a salary. You have to go out and procure your own grant funding to support your research. So I wrote grants for 25 years and got quite a bit of success. My emphasis was on something called integrated pest management. That is the use of multiple tactics, not single tactics, to control major pests. And I worked on 3 crops: corn, peanuts, and soybeans. And I would try to design projects to find out ways to control major insect pests in those 3 crops by using predators and parasites and cultural controls, like the spacing between rows in a crop, rather than synthetic organic pesticides. I never sprayed a single crop I ever worked in with a pesticide.
And that's really amazing because, we hear there's kind of a general history or understanding of DDT, for example, you mentioned earlier, and the kind of popular narrative as well. At a certain point, these kind of first world nations that you mentioned got really enlightened and did away with DDT. But there's never any kind of part B that you've already mentioned, which is, well, a lot of these chemicals were just shipped to countries in the third world. But also, even this narrative about integrative pest management to me is fascinating, Carl, because even today, I take my students every summer. For example, we go to the Mississippi Delta to do oral history work, and the students comment about, these thousands and thousands of acres of corn, which is mainly raised there now, of course, for fuel, soybeans, et cetera, et cetera. But there's never really there's not much thought now to this whole notion of integrated pest management.
Correct. Let me give you a story about the Mississippi Delta. I worked in the Cañete Valley in Peru for a while. Now, the Cañete Valley was the #1 place in the world for the use of biological control in cotton management. And it was extremely successful. Peru led the world at that time. Now, there was a man by the name of Code, C-O-A-D, who lived in the Mississippi Delta. And Mr. Code had 2 airplanes. And he would spray pesticides over cotton in the Mississippi Delta. This was in the late 40s, 50s. Now, he had a friend that got a job in the Ministry of Agriculture in Peru. And he invited Mr. Code down to Peru to bring his 2 airplanes and spray cotton in the Cañete Valley. He did. And it so disrupted the biological control of cotton that he was literally run out of Peru by presidential mandate. I had a meeting with the Entomological Society of Peru one evening, and outside of me, the youngest man in the room was 82. They were all practicing entomologists at that time. And Mr. Code brought his airplanes back to the Mississippi Delta, and he divided them into two groups. One group continued to spray pesticides. The other one started shuttling passengers back and forth across the Mississippi Delta. That was the origin of Delta Airlines. Delta Airlines was literally a run out of Peru pesticide applicating service.
That is a great story. I never heard that before. I rode Delta back to Gainesville this past weekend.
Just look under the wings to see if you see the nozzles when you get on it next. Okay,
Okay.
I'm joking about that.
And these are great. This is really great history, Carl. I'm actually going to share this. My wife Sheila grew up on a farm in Homestead, Florida, and she used to get into big arguments with her father about things like DDT and Roundup. Mm-hmm. And he was from the old school. He'd say, why did they ever do away with that? It wasn't that bad and everything. And she'd say, Dad, it's really bad. Of course, she was in college. She wasn't in college when Silent Spring came out, but that book had an enormous impact on her, and her generation.
Well, my wife grew up in a rural community in Central Texas, and you would see farmers in that community stirring toxic pesticides with their hands. And you ask them about it, and they would say, well, if the bugs can get resistant to it, so can I. Indicating they don't understand how resistance works. I used to illustrate to my bugs and people class. Now, these were non-science students. I had 300 of them, 320 of them 4 times a year. I said, one of you in this room has got a gene that would confer you to resistance of some compound I'm holding in my hands. How do I find out who that is? It's easy. I spray all of you. The one that lives has the gene. And I said, that one reproduces. And I said, then the gene gets more frequent. You do that several times, all of a sudden you have resistance. That's how genetics work. Okay, and that's exactly how it works in insects too.
Now, Carl, when you, looking into your background, I found a whole cohort of articles and specials that were written and produced when you retired, because when you retired, your kind of identity on campus, you were an incredibly popular professor and advisor. You advised a lot of different student groups. I wonder if you could mention, you did mention that this course that you taught, a very large course where you tried to introduce students to kind of the basics of entomology. Could you talk about what it was like to teach non-science students and some of the other kind of pedagogical techniques you used to do that?
Well, I was the only professor in my department who actually taught courses over the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And I started teaching in the honors program over there. And myself and a distinguished service professor named Paul Doring at the College of Pharmacy. His son was more famous than he was as a wide receiver in the Spurrier era. Okay. Paul and I taught a course for honor students in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences called Pesticides and Pills. And what we did is we traced the history of medicine and food production from medieval times to current times. They share an extremely common development process. We had 20 students in that first class. All 20 of them ended up being MDs. They were very, very bright students. One of them is now the head of emergency medicine at Shands. So it's interesting. Okay. Well, I got tired of teaching only 20 and I wanted to teach a large class. And so I said, I can do this. So I applied and got the permission to teach bugs and people. And they let me teach it in one of the big Turlington auditoriums. At that time, I was working in Preview. And now Preview is not there anymore because you know that story. Okay, I don't want to go into that detail.
That's sad.
But I was the only faculty member who talked to all 6,600 incoming students. And mine was, wake up, this isn't high school. They did not want to hear that. And they had some pretty big egos because these were some pretty bright kids. But in the fall semester each year, my email would light up saying, you're right, this is not high school. I'm in trouble. I need help. You know, I did not learn how to study in high school. That was over and over and over and over. You know how that story works. So I said to myself, naively, I can teach a big class and have discussion just like I can in a small class. So I want you to picture one of those large auditorium in Turlington Hall, where I'm standing down there looking, and there's a section to my left, a big section in the middle, and a section to my right. I came in the first day of class, and all three sections were literally full. And I said, folks, we're going to have discussions in this class. Here's how we're going to do it. At the end of each lecture, I want to engage in a conversation with the first 4 rows of the center section. Everybody else just sit and listen. And I said, over time, I want you to rotate in and out of that center section first 4 rows so that everybody gets a shot. Paul, when I came to class the second lecture, there was not a single person sitting in the first 4 rows of the center section. Their attitude, they were standing around the walls. Their attitude was, if we wanted to talk to you, we wouldn't be in this class. And so I gave up on discussions in a big class. That was a lesson in humility for me. But we had fun. Till this day, 12 years after my retirement, I still get emails and sometimes Christmas cards from lawyers and doctors and Wall Street financiers who took that class as a freshman. They said, I remember that class more than I remember my major. We would have a medieval bug fair at the end of it. They had to dress up as their favorite bug. TV 20 came and covered that twice out on Turlington Plaza. I enjoyed it. I loved what I did. That answer your question?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that I would just love to get, I'm thinking about when we deposit the interview, when we process it and it goes to the University of Florida Digital Collections, it also, the Smathers Libraries gives us space to bring in other materials. And I wonder if you have, this is not for today, and you can take your time on it if you decide to do it. But, it would be really, I think, cool to get one or more of those syllabi or even course outlines from that course, and perhaps, maybe deposit it along with the interview. That's just something to think about.
Well, unfortunately, I don't have it anymore. Okay. I turned that course over to my successor, Dr. Rebecca Baldwin, and I gave her Bugs and People. She has now worked through it and made it her course. So It doesn't look like my course anymore. The general structure's there, but she put her own materials in. So I don't have that syllabus anymore. Sorry.
Oh, no, that's fine. So it's good to know that, so we can make sure, because it's interesting at universities. As a historian, it's frustrating because universities are the worst places on the planet in terms of understanding how traditions, practices get passed down from one generation to the other. Universities have such short institutional memory. So that's
exactly. I worked with Dr. Baldwin for almost a year prior to my retirement to pass this on to her. She sat through my lectures. I let her give a few of them. So she was ready by the time I retired to take it over.
Excellent.
I considered that part of my obligation.
That's great to know. Well, Carl, you mentioned advising, and I'm really fascinated by, how you approached advising. Obviously, it's something we're not trained to do in graduate school. Our research may or may not help us think about how do you bring in a new generation of younger people into higher education. What were some of your successes and things maybe not so successful, as you started trying to advise, these really bright younger students?
When I left the provost office and went back to entomology, I told my chair, I did not want to do research anymore. I was toward the end of a career. I want to be a full-time teacher advisor. He agreed with that, and I was the only one in my college that had that appointment. 100% FTE, teaching and advising. So I would teach a number of courses, including beginning entomology for the majors. I taught grant writing for PhD level students, and I was a full-time advisor. I formed an entomology club. That club, for the first 2 years, had 4 members, 4 students. Today, it's got 64 students. It has grown. Now, I very much took a tough love approach to advising because I found out that students would come into the University of Florida with a false sense of what they knew and what they didn't know, especially when it came to their ability to study. And so students would come visit with me after preview. And many of them wanted to talk to me about becoming an entomology major. We had 6 different tracks they could choose from. Almost to the person, every one of them wanted to go to medical school or veterinary school or dental school. And I would say, okay, I'll put you in that for 1 semester. Then I'm going to look at your grade point average. If that grade point average drops below 3.8, I'm no longer going to let you stay in that major because your chances of going to professional school are slim and none. They did not like that. Okay? They did not like that. So I became unpopular with some of them. Some of them listened and were successful. But I said, you know, if you end up making a C in organic chemistry, you're not going to professional school. It's not going to happen. Okay? So that was my criterion right there. And they would choose different tracks and ended up being successful. But I paid the price of popularity meanwhile. But I could sleep at night because I was telling them the truth. I had one-on-one advising in my office. I did not do group advising. I would help them register for the courses they needed. I would make sure they understood the next sequence of courses that were required. I put that responsibility on them to learn that material and come back to me and show me they learned it. In other words, to take responsibility for their own degree. And I warned them that you're going to run into professors with all different kinds of personalities, all different kinds of the ways they examine you and grade your exams. So you're going to have to adjust one class to the next. You cannot have one learning style and get a degree at the University of Florida. It just doesn't work that way. And once they bought into that, they succeeded. So I felt like I had a decent strategy for advising. Now, the community college students I was working with always wanted to come to the University of Florida. Santa Fe, at that time, Santa Fe Community College was always under threat by the state legislature because so many students left the district they were in and came to Gainesville to go to Santa Fe thinking it was a gateway into UF. Now, the way the community college system was set up is you were supposed to attend the one that was in your county or sometimes combinations of counties. And students would not honor that. They would come to Gainesville. And they did not understand that it's not a gateway. You don't automatically. They had no idea what a restricted admit major was, limited access. You know, the state legislature guarantees you access to a 4-year university, but not necessarily the one you want to go to. And they didn't get that when they first came here. And so I had to work with them. I would go out to Santa Fe every summer and work every one of their orientation sessions all summer long to talk to their incoming students about this. So I took this seriously.
Now, Carl, as you know, our colleagues, you mentioned different learning styles. Our colleagues have different approaches to advising, to helping students become successful. Did you ever feel like, push back against your philosophy or your approach, your tough love approach, as you put it? Were there those who said, maybe there's another approach, maybe, go softer with them or something? Or
well, not in my department. It was respected in my department because they didn't want to. Number one, most of my colleagues didn't want to do any advising, so they were glad I was doing it. Okay, you have to understand, Paul, that one of the things that I got a liberal arts undergraduate degree. When I got to my PhD degree, I was there with students who got a bachelor's in entomology, a master's in entomology, and were now pursuing a PhD in entomology. They knew so much more about insects than I did, but they didn't have any social skills. They had no interpersonal skill development that allowed them to impart that information to a client out there in the real world that could understand it. I had those skills because of a liberal arts undergraduate education. And so that turned out to be an asset. And what I found out is I could learn the entomology, but at that stage in life, they couldn't learn those social skills that passed them by. Most of them ended up working for pesticide companies. That was the name of the game back then. Not me. I wanted nothing to do with that.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'll just say, personally, as a military, third generation military veteran, we grew up with the whole issue of Agent Orange. My father has systemic Agent Orange poisoning. He's a retired military veteran. But I can remember even as a kid, hearing the veterans around me talking about how, well, yeah, the government and the Dow, I believe, was Agent Orange, how they were kind of in cahoots with each other and denying.
Oh, sure. The VA denied it was even a problem when these people got back. Now, I would have gone to Vietnam if my draft number had come up. In the fall of 1969, I stayed up till 10 minutes after 4 in the morning, listening to those lottery picks. Mine was number 303. My roommate was number 1. He dropped out the next day, enlisted, and 14 months later stepped on a claymore in the Mekong Delta. They found his dog tags, not him.
Terrible.
2 of my friends came back and committed suicide after they got back, which was not at all an uncommon phenomenon. Turns out both of them were the so-called tunnel rats. And they came back heroin addicts. And it turns out it was their first lieutenant who hooked them. They wouldn't go down in those dark holes with a single knife and pistol without being high. And if he threatened to withhold their fix if they didn't go. Those were their messages to me. So would I have gone? Yeah, I'd have gone. Well, am I glad I didn't? Yeah, I'm glad I didn't.
Yeah, exactly.
Were you there?
No, I was in Central America, actually Honduras. I was in Honduras, in the mid 80s. So that was a generation later. I graduated from high school in 82, but my father retired in the Navy. He had been in the Marines. He had actually been recruited to take part in the Bay of Pigs invasion. Didn't go, so I'm here.
What were you doing in Honduras?
Well, I was in 7th Special Forces, and so we were.
Okay.
So I was a fixer. So I was in communications. I mainly worked on my own, and so I would working along a lot of work along the border of Honduras and Nicaragua and other places too. But training people, doing things that in retrospect, we should have been training people how to read, how to do anything else other than training people how to shoot.
Yep.
And so, but that's, you mentioned Honduras, and I can tell you that I wish more people had made the choices that you made. I think the world would be a lot better place right now for it. I wanted, Carl, you had a quote when you retired. People, it was very common back and it still is, to ask people like their favorite quote. And here's a quote that came up quite often. I'll just read it to you. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind talking to me about what that quote means to you and why it's so important. So the quote was from one of the pieces, actually 2 or 3 of the pieces when you retired. And I think it may have run on the WUFT story. But the quote said from you, Dr. Barfield, quote, "You have the right to be adventuresome, but not the right to be stupid." What does that mean?
That means take responsibility for yourself. That was a quote that I used often with my students. You should explore. You're at very much in an exploratory stage in your life. You should find out what you have a passion for, okay? But you do not have a right to ignore the realities of a university education. Studying properly, by not paying attention to teaching styles, not paying attention to life styles, You have a right to be. Do not have a right to shoot. That's what it meant to me.
Now, also, Carl, you mentioned earlier, I'm not going to put you too much on the spot about this, but I'm going to kind of rephrase a question that we touched upon earlier. You served under 5 different presidents at the University of Florida, during your tenure as a faculty member. Who do you feel did the best job at UF as a university president, and why? Give us some concrete examples.
Well, the only president that I've served under that was an academician was John Lombardi. And he came out of a university setting. Some of them came out of politics. And the one I think you have now came out of politics. Okay. I'd just soon skip that if that's okay with you. Okay. I met John Lombardi because at the time he came in here to be president, I was the chair of his advisory committee, the FEPG, Faculty Education Policy Group. We had a big meeting with distinguished professors from various departments. He sat at the end of that table, and the professor from English, a distinguished service professor whom I did not know, sat immediately to Lombardi's right. I sat immediately to Lombardi's left. He started off and actually, this professor of English, what do you think? That man stood up, pounded his fist on the table, and said, "No way in hell are my faculty ever going to teach beginning English. It's not going to happen." Lombardi didn't say anything, moved on around the table, listened to everybody else. He got around to me. And he said, "Dr. Barfield, what do you think we need?" I said, "I think you need some new English faculty." And oh boy, that dude stared a hole through me. So when the meeting was over, Lombardi pointed to me and said, "Can I see you in my office?" And I thought, oh God, I didn't start off too well. He shook my hand and said, "I like you." We were friends ever since. And he was the one that put me in the provost office. The Teaching Improvement Project, okay? The faculty, the Teaching Improvement, the TIP, TIP, Teaching Improvement Project. He put me in charge of making sure all the different colleges followed the state rules. And so I had to go around to those colleges and make sure they were playing by the rules. And that was a lot of responsibility. Funny story with that. One of the department chairs down in, well, I'm not going to mention the department chair. One of the department the deans was not following the rules because he was deathly afraid of one of his department chairs. And so he and I got in a verbal battle. Lombardi called me one day and said, "I need to see you in my office." And so I said, he said, "I need to see you right now." I said, "Oh, okay." Well, I go over there and he's opened the door. He said, "That man's wife and my wife are best friends. You are making my life hell." He said, "Cut that out." So I did. But he was honest like that.
Yeah.
And I admired him so much. The other one I thought was a scholar as well was Bob Bryan. Now, Bob Bryan, when I started to teach grant writing, I went over and met with the graduate committee. It was chaired at that time by Madeline Lockhart. Yeah. Madeline Lockhart had 2 surgeons on that committee with her. When I got through presenting the case for wanting to teach grant writing, she said, "Sir, we do not allow the teaching of skills courses at this university." I said, "Excuse me?" I said, "Are you telling me those gentlemen on either side of you should tell their surgical students that they can't practice any surgery till they get their degree and go out and for the first time it's on a patient?" I said, "Isn't that a skill?" She asked me to leave. So I made up my mind that I was going to wait till Madeline Lockhart passed away and submit it again. I did. It was approved unanimously. But that's the kind of client that was in this place. So Bob Bryan stopped me one day and said, "I understand you had a run-in with a graduate committee." I said, "Yes, I did." He looked me in the eyes. He said, "I'm not going to help you. That lady scares the hell out of me." So he was honest, straightforward. The rest of them I never knew personally.
Yeah, interesting because, you mentioned, leadership of the university, and yeah, it's really important. But then all the things you're talking about, advising, teaching, research, that happens, and that's really the life of the university.
Well,
But
there's some things that have frustrated me here, Paul. There is animosity, big time animosity between the College of Agriculture and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And I think it has to do with the fact that we are on a 12-month appointment. Arts and Sciences is on a 9-month appointment. We get things like annual leave. You don't. Okay. I think that and we get our own separate funding. And back when what was his name? I'll think of it in a second. We had a certain vice president of agriculture. He got the legislature to agree that Florida's College of Agriculture would recoup all of its indirect costs. Didn't share it with anybody else on campus. Whereas the rest of the campus, with the exception of Shands, shares their indirect cost. Shands and IFAS don't. And I think that created a lot of animosity. I have tried a number of times to teach courses with people in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences to have their chairs tell me my faculty will never work with anybody from agriculture. I will not allow it. I hope that's changed now, but I've heard that a lot of times.
Well, Carl, it's not to editorialize too much, but when President Fox first came in, he called me and asked me to be in a campus-wide task force, I think it was a goals and visions task force, and the idea was we would produce a document to help UF, get into the top 10 or something. This was right when Kent came in. And so Wynn Phillips, I think, chaired that task force. I
know Wynn very well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I've co-chaired other things with Wynn. But it was interesting, Carl, you mentioned that, because one of the things about that task force, and by the way, it was it was almost free. Basically, we had no research staff that I remember. We did the research. It was faculty and administrators, 17 of us. Whereas the new one, I understand they've spent 4.5 million on. But back then, when we did this process, it involved us on the task force going out to different units at UF across the state and sharing discussions with each unit about how can the university help your unit make it into the top 10. I mean, it was a little more complex than that, but that was basically it. How can we help you become better? And so one of I shared discussions in 11 units. One of them was emerging pathogens, the libraries, one of the biotechs, but wherever it was, everyone pretty much gave me the same message to take back to the presidential task force. And that is, we need more cooperation on this campus across units. And historically, there's too much competition between units. And I think it was the chair of emerging pathogens or one of the other sciences, as he put it to me, a really compelling example. He said, Paul, it's almost like you're getting ready to go out and play the World Cup in soccer, and you're facing the Brazilian national team. And you're the American team, and you go to the captain of the Brazilian team and you tell him, hey, before we play in the championship against your team, which is the best in the world, my team is going to scrimmage against each other for an hour, and then we're going to play you right afterwards. And he said, that just doesn't make any sense. And so one of the things we came back to President Fox was, let's think of ways that we can cooperate more internally. IDC, I don't have to tell you, was a big topic in that discussion. But yeah, it's an ongoing issue on the campus, I think.
Well, that's something I thought long and hard about. It was one of my biggest frustrations as a faculty member. I tended to be very unconventional. I didn't focus just on bugs. That's not what I thought my calling in life was. Okay. It was my card to be on the faculty, but I spent more time across campus throughout the time of my career than I did within my own department. And that was by choice. Okay. That's going back to that liberal arts education. Can you think of a single thing at the University of Florida that faculty don't compete for? They compete for space. They compete for allocation of annual budgets. They compete for grants. Okay? They compete for everything. They compete for prestige. Only so many of them can get tenured at any one time. They compete for those slots. How do you expect cooperation in an environment that is based 100% on competition? It doesn't work that way. Human nature is not like that. It's either you or me. A lot of faculty members have that attitude, okay? And as far as I'm concerned, it's going to be me. So why would I want to cooperate with you, okay? And that was the biggest frustration I had. And I think I was right. I think that's true. We compete. I wrote an article in the Alligator one time when I was associate provost about that, you know? And Bob Bryan looked me up and said, about time somebody said that. You know, I was very unconventional. Well, I loved what I did. I gave a TED talk one time. And would you like a copy of that?
Would love a copy of that.
I'll send you my, it's on YouTube. I'll send that to you. When we get off here, I'll send you that link. Insects in Human Society. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I ended up by saying, I hope you people can develop a career that you love what you do as much as I love what I do. It's frustrating, yes, but I love my job. Now, it was time for me to retire, Paul, because I got tired of the students coming in the last 5 years of my career with such a sense of entitlement. They felt like we owed them a degree just because they showed up. And I couldn't abide that. And I found myself increasingly butting heads with those students in class and then advising for them. And so it was time for me to move on. So I retired. Unfortunately and sadly, a few years later, my wife was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And it turned out to be the frontal lobe version, so she didn't live long. And I moved her out to the village here where I am into memory care. And I moved into memory care with her, thinking I could help her. I was wrong. I couldn't. And I stayed there 3.5 months and then moved out because she got violent. She passed away in January of this year. And I moved out to independent living. So I went the reverse direction of the way most people went here. Now I give 3 seminars a month out here on a variety of topics. Not just bugs and not just biology. And the very first seminar I gave, I had 4 residents show up. The last one I gave, I had 84 show up. So I've developed a following, and that makes me proud. What I'm most proud of is I modified some of those to offer them to the memory care residents, the ones with mental illness. And I focused on music because music is therapeutic. The last one I did was music through the ages. I started in the 1920s and went to the 1990s, playing the most popular songs of each decade, playing it for them, okay, off YouTube. They danced, they sang, they had a ball. And they keep asking me, when are you coming back? So I'm proud of what I've done out here. I don't know what else I can say. I guess I'll die here. This is where I am. My parents are both gone. Well, my mother's 95. She's in the last stages of living out in Texas. My father died about 3 years ago. I have no siblings. So this is where I am. I have 2 sons. They're both down in South Florida with their own lives. I don't ever see them very much. So I find that I'm not unique here. The only people who get visitations out here are the ones whose family lives here in Gainesville. And so it's not at all uncommon. So you play the hand you're dealt. And I just wish I could be the dealer, Paul. What else would you like to know? We've about taken up an hour.
Well, it's been a great hour for me to learn just all of this incredible information from you. And one of the things that came up, you spent at UF, you spent a lot of time, as you mentioned, outside of your department, doing incredible work throughout the university. And you talked about a couple of the presidents that you served with in your advising work. You mentioned a few names. I remember interviewing Madeline Lockhart was one of the first people I interviewed when I arrived at UF. But are there other colorful personalities you remember during your career that you think that we should remember today that we might not?
Well, Paul Doring, he's retired now, was a distinguished service professor in pharmacy. He's one. He and I taught together, spent a lot of time together. Very colorful character, very well respected. He ran the Poison Control Center down there. So that's one, Doering, Doring. Okay. Well, let's see. Most of the people that had a lot of sage wisdom when I was in entomology aren't living anymore. So I clearly can't refer you to them. So he's the one.
I just mean, Carl, just people who you think of that. I mean, we wouldn't interview them now, but people who had a big impact on the university that we might not normally. I mean, Dr. Lombardi obviously is someone whose name is up there and enshrined. Maybe some of the unsung heroes.
Well, you mentioned Wynn Phillips. You interviewed him?
I've interviewed Wynn, but it's interesting because we interviewed him specifically about you would appreciate this. We interviewed him about the education and engineering program that he was so instrumental in being a part of.
That's the only other college in existence that has an extension service like agriculture does. There is an engineering extension just like there's an agricultural extension. Nobody else comes to mind right now, Paul, but if I think of someone, I'll send it to you in email.
Okay, perfect. And this has been fabulous. And Carl, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and stop the recording.